Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 30 minutes of Torah study for the week that the Torah portion of Parshas Emor falls in. What's the topic for tonight? Jews don't pray, they daven. What exactly does that mean? Let's figure it out. On the calendar, we are in a period that is called the Sfiras Omer. We are counting the days from when the Jews left Egypt, free from slavery, on their way to the giving of the Torah. We count the days. The famous speech that Moshe gave to Paro, he said, "Let my people go," but it did not just end there. He says, "Let my people go so that they will be able to serve me." What does it mean that the Jewish people are meant to serve God? So in a general sense, it refers to the observance of Torah and mitzvahs. Moshe says to Paro, what is the entire purpose of the freedom from slavery in Egypt? It is in order that we shall serve God, serving God through Torah and mitzvahs. However, if we want to be more precise, if we want to be more specific, serving God means prayer. That is how the idea of serving God is understood in rabbinic literature. To serve God means to pray. Because of the fact that this time period, the period of the Omer, is from the exodus from Egypt towards the receiving of the Torah, which is when we were given this command to serve God, which really means to pray, Jewish tradition places an added emphasis on this time period of the year for prayer. While a person should have intentional and meaningful prayer throughout the year, it's specifically during the time of the Omer that is almost set aside to have more introspective, more deep, more meaningful prayer.
I forgot I got class at 7:30 on Thursday.
The connection between the exodus from Egypt and prayer is actually something that is recorded in the code of Jewish law and is relevant just about every time we pray. There's a mitzvah to say Shema every day, twice a day, and we're going to talk about tonight the mitzvah to pray. The code of Jewish law says there's a special mitzvah to connect Shema to prayer. There's a special mitzvah to go directly from speaking about the exodus from Egypt to reciting the Amidah. Because that's so important, you may have noticed in the Siddur that when it comes to the blessing before the Amidah begins, it says in the Siddur, do not respond Amen. Now that's very unusual. Usually when you hear a blessing, you're supposed to respond Amen. However, when we say the blessing at the end of Shema before the Amidah, we do not respond Amen, because we do not want there to be any separation, even for a moment, even for a second, even of one holy word, between the exodus from Egypt and prayer. Because what is the result? What is the product of our exodus from Egypt? It is meant to and must lead into heartfelt, deep, meaningful prayer. Let's go to text number 1b, the Ran. He writes, God redeemed us from Egypt to be his servants. As the verse states, for they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. In the blessing of redemption, we mention God's kindness to us. And prayer is also service. As the Talmud states, to love God and to serve him with all your heart, this refers to prayer. So when we mention the Exodus and immediately pray, we demonstrate that just as a servant is obligated to follow his master's command, so do we recognize the kindness that God did to us and that we are indentured in his service. Recognizing that we are God's servants because he redeems us motivates us to fulfill his mitzvahs. In turn, we merit a portion in the world to come. So prayer follows immediately after the mention of the exodus from Egypt. In the Shema, we mentioned the exodus from Egypt. Immediately following that exodus, we move into prayer. Again, so much so we do not even respond Amen in the middle because we don't want to cause an interruption. We recognize that the freedom that we were given is for the purpose of having a commitment and a relationship to God. So the freedom reminds us to focus on our relationship with God, which is what prayer is all about. Now, how do we categorize the concepts of prayer? The majority opinion amongst rabbis throughout Jewish history is that praying is a mitzvah. It is one of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah that a person has to pray at least one time a day Certainly, at least when a person has a need, you're obligated to pray to God. There was a later development after the destruction of the temple. There's a rabbinic innovation that we pray 3 times a day. But from the majority perspective, there is at least a biblical obligation, perhaps, to pray once a day. However, there is one great scholar, one of the greatest, most influential sages of all time, who has a different opinion. This is the Ramban. Not the Rambam, the Ramban with an N at the end of his name, Nachmanides in English. And he writes that prayer is not one of the 613 mitzvahs. This does not mean he doesn't like prayer. Tremendous fan of prayer, big believer in prayer. It's quite nice, but not a mitzvah. So the Ran writes like this. The entire notion of prayer isn't compulsory at all. Rather, it's a great kindness that God has afforded us, that he listens and responds anytime we call out to him. The Ramban says we're not commanded to pray. It's not one of the 613 mitzvahs. Rather, it's a gift that God gave us, that we have the ability to pray and, so to speak, change God's mind and deliver for us that which is what we need. The Ramban continues, the primary message of the verse, serve God with all your heart, is to hand down a positive commandment that all our godly services should be with a full heart, namely with proper intention for his name and without any negative thoughts. We should never do any of the mitzvahs without intention or doubting whether or not they have any purpose. This is in the spirit of the verse, and you shall love God with all your soul and all your might. Namely, there's a mitzvah to love God with a full heart, so much so that we're willing to risk our property and our lives for this love. So the Ramban is writing how prayer is such a meaningful thing, a beautiful thing, a deep thing. It's all about love. It's all about emotion. It's all about connection to God. But it's not a mitzvah. It's not one of the 613 commandments. But how is that possible? How could it be something that is so fundamental and so foundational, something that's so at the heart, at the center of Jewish life, that the Rambam could think that somehow it's not a mitzvah, you don't count it in the mitzvahs? Let's look at what some other sages have to say. Rabbi Yosef Albo, right, his book on the fundamental principles of Judaism, he writes, it is only appropriate that anyone who believes in providence must believe that prayer will help them and save them from misfortune. If one does not pray in a time of trouble, it is either because they don't believe in providence or because they do believe in providence, though they do believe in providence, they doubt God's ability to save them, both of which are forms of disbelief. Rabbi Yosef Albo explains, prayer is Judaism 101. The idea that a person can pray to God and that will change the outcome and the results, that's the basics. Just like we had in our class last night, if a person has a nightmare, what does the Torah say? You fast. You pray. Why? Because Judaism believes that prayer can change the mind of God. So that is why we pray. Prayer is critical to the life of a Jew. We have the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. He writes, prayer is one of the foundations of our belief, because through prayer, a person comes to know and understand that God alone runs the world and supervises every detail of his creatures, and that he alone has the ability to deliver salvation. Again, prayer is such a foundational and such a fundamental principle of Judaism. It literally is teaching us that God runs the world, and we can appeal to him to change things that are happening in the world. How could the Ramban say that something which is, again, so fundamental and so foundational is not a mitzvah? There's a phenomenal story. I'm sure you've heard it before. Rabbi Eliezer Silver, one of the most prominent Orthodox rabbis in the United States, went to Europe after World War II, went around to the DP camps, did everything and anything he can to help his fellow brothers and sisters. He arrives in Mauthausen concentration camp. He's trying to put together a minyan. He's trying to get people to daven. And he asks one particular person to daven, and the guy says, absolutely not. I will not, under any circumstances, daven ever again in my life. And Rabbi Eliezer Silver says, why? What happened? And he says to him, I was in the concentration camp all these years. We were starving. We had nothing, skin and bones. There was one guy who gained weight in the concentration camp. How did he gain weight? He had one pair of tefillin. And he charged people a piece of their bread in order to be able to put on that tefillin. And every morning there was a huge line behind the barracks starting at 4 o'clock in the morning for people to be able to do the mitzvah and to daven. And he got fat. He gained weight from all the bread that he took from Jews that are skin and bones. This is what davening is. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So Rabbi Silver said to him, I don't understand why you're looking at it this way. This guy, this one individual, maybe he didn't do the right thing. But hundreds of Jews gave up their bread when they were skin and bones. Why? Because davening was so important to them. It was so foundational, so fundamental to them. It's so key to what it means to be a Jew that every day, 4 a.m., risking their life, giving away their bread just to be able to do that mitzvah, to be able to daven. How could the Ramban say that davening is not one of the mitzvahs? So we have to understand, where is he coming from? What really is prayer all about from the Jewish perspective? So on the one hand, if you look at davening in a very simple, very straightforward, very basic way, davening is asking God for things you need. Could be health, could be financial, could even be sports related. You are asking God for a need that you have, and the hope, the goal, God will answer you, God will respond, God will grant you good things. But this is a very, very basic, elementary understanding of what davening is. Davening really is something so much more than just asking God for things. Let's look what the Talmud has to say. The Talmud says it was taught regarding the verse to love God and to serve him with all your heart, which is the service of God that is performed in the heart. You must say that this is referring to prayer. What this text tells us, that even though prayer is that asking God for things, requests are part of prayer, that's not what prayer is. The definition of prayer is an expression of love to God. It's meant to be an emotional experience. The primary element is not so much saying the words. It's not bending your knees and bending down at the right point and standing up and sitting down at the right point. It's not being on tune, which whatever song they're singing in the shul, but it's a profound emotional experience that requires a tangible feeling of love. And this applies to prayer more than it does to any other mitzvahs. Most mitzvahs that are out there are action-oriented mitzvahs. Even though a person is supposed to have an incredible internal, intellectual, and emotional experience, at the end of the day, if all you did was the bare bones action, you have fulfilled the mitzvah. If Rabbi Avremi dragged you into a Seder, you were on the way to the movie theater, and Avremi bumped into you outside his house, and he grabbed you into the house, and it said, it's Pesach, you have to eat matzah, and he gave you matzah to eat. You did the mitzvah 100%. Even though your mind, your soul, your heart, your emotions are in a totally different place, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you ate the matzah. But when it comes to davening, if your heart isn't in it, if your mind isn't in it, what did you do? You didn't do anything. You repeated like a parrot some Hebrew words. You stood up, you stood down. Davening is a mitzvah that in order to count it as davening, there has to be something going on in between. It literally is the service of the heart. It's about emotions. Without feeling, without intention, is it really prayer? Could you even classify it as prayer? Yes, the words are important, but the words are important because the words are the vessel that contain the emotion that you're trying to get. Right? The words play a role. They're a powerful tool in helping to elicit the emotion, but the emotion is absolutely critical. Now, it's not so easy to just conjure up and to express emotion. Therefore, preparing for prayer is a very important part of prayer. If you don't prepare for the prayer, how do you expect to be in the right frame of mind? Look what it says about prayer. Rambam, he writes in his Code of Jewish Law, what is meant by proper intention? One should clear his mind from all thoughts and envision himself as standing before the divine presence. Therefore, one must sit a short while before praying in order to focus his attention and then pray in a pleasant and supplicatory fashion. Before a person can pray, you got to close your eyes. You have to think for a minute. I am standing before the King of Kings, God Almighty. I'm conversing with him. I'm speaking to him. I'm connecting with him. You got to erase everything from your mind. You got to get yourself the right mindset to pray. It's part of Jewish law. A person has to prepare themselves. Put yourself in the mindset to be open to be able to pray. The Mishnah says that the original pious ones used to wait 1 hour and then pray in order to direct their hearts toward God. The Talmud says that in the era of the Mishnah of the Gemara, the sages would meditate, they'd think about, they'd prepare themselves for 1 hour before praying. In order to maximize the experience of prayer, takes preparation, you got to prepare yourself. This is why in all Chabad yeshiva systems, the day does not start with prayer, it starts with the study of Hasidic philosophy. For an hour and a half, there's the study about God to focus your mind, to focus your heart, to get yourself in the framework so that you literally feel I am now standing before God and I can pray. So prayer is much more than requests. It's much more than the rituals themselves. It comes from the heart, it comes from the soul. The Hasidic movement, perhaps above and maybe more than any other movement, places an extra emphasis on prayer. So I want to share a few teachings that relate to prayer that come from the perspective of Chassidus. First, we have a statement. The Rebbes would teach that if a Jew experiences any deterioration in their religious life, it could only be because he or she is neglecting to properly pray. The Rebbe is saying here that prayer is literally the battery that drives your soul, which energizes all of the other religious and spiritual experiences of your life. If the other spiritual and religious experiences of your life are lacking energy, they're lacking focus, you're kind of slacking a little bit, it can only be because your prayer is starting to slip away. Your prayer is not what it is meant to be. The Rebbe writes, the first stage in a person's spiritual decline, heaven forbid, is a lack of effort when serving God in prayer. Everything becomes parched and cold. Even the routine performance of mitzvahs becomes burdensome. One hurries through their observance and loses a taste for Torah study. The very atmosphere becomes more materially oriented, and it goes without saying that a person in such a state cannot positively influence others at all. Davening is meant to be a time where you recharge your spiritual batteries, you connect to God on a deep emotional level, a soulful level. If that doesn't happen, the rest of your religious life is going to fall apart. Just as in a marriage, if from time to time a husband and wife don't connect on a deep emotional level, there isn't some intimacy, there isn't some emotion there, then everything else will just become dry, it'll become rote, it's going to be mechanical, and the relationship is going to suffer. So when it comes to our relationship with God, the key is davening. When we daven right, we have that energy, that excitement that overflows into everything else we do. If davening falls away, then everything else starts to fall away as well. Davening is meant to be a time where we bond with God, we connect with God. It's about spending quality time with God. I'm going to read these words, these holy words that praise, that laud, that compliment God. And I'm going to invite that into my life. I'm going to make that real for myself. The Alter Rebbe writes, the Talmud describes how the original pious ones used to wait 1 hour for each one of the 3 prayers of the day, as well as spend an hour praying, and then wait another hour. Therefore, it turns out that they spent 9 hours engaged in prayer every day. An hour before, an hour during, and an hour after. Why were they not concerned with the time it took away from Torah study, which is equivalent to all other mitzvahs? Imagine you spend praying 9 hours a day. It's not going to leave you a lot of time for other things. It is because when they prayed, they would connect with God with such a strong and authentic sense of love and fear that they would be stripped of all materialism. An authentic connection with God with such love and fear is an even greater mitzvah than Torah study and supersedes it. As the verse states, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. Yes, they prayed for that amount of time because that's how valuable it was. That's how significant it was. And the spillover into the rest of the day was absolutely worthwhile. When you pray, you're rolling up your mental, emotional, and spiritual sleeves and going to work. When a person prays, you open up that siddur. If you're a man, you put on that talis. The attitude is, let's accomplish something. Let's actually go somewhere. How could I be a different person than anyone before? You're metaphorically rolling up those sleeves. It's time to get to work. The Rebbe writes, and as much as the act of prayer is created through human work, it only makes sense that the primary change occurs in the person who prays. The principal idea of prayer is the notion that one stands as a servant before their master, before God himself. One ought to imagine themselves standing before God's presence, and then they become an entity that prays. When a person clears out any distracting thoughts and pours out their heart to God, that alone changes them from their previous standing. They are now in a higher space, a changed person. I mentioned earlier that Chabad, perhaps more than any other group, emphasizes the value of prayer and works at it. It's a job. It's something you work out to try to get better at it so it'll impact you. As a result of this, there's an artist, my favorite artist, a Chabad painter. I want to share with you some of his paintings which depict the authentic experience of prayer from the Chabad perspective. This is an absolutely gorgeous painting. This is a painting of a Chabad chassid who is sitting in the corner of the shul. You don't see a prayer book in his hand. His talis is over his head, and he is preparing himself. He's gearing himself up for the act of prayer, for the job of prayer, for the labor of prayer. He's putting himself in the right framework, in the right mindset. I'm standing before God. I'm trying to plug myself in. I'm blocking everything out. Cell phones off. All distractions are off. I'm plugging in. Such a beautiful painting here that depicts a chassid preparing for davening. Another painting, again, also Zalman Kleiman, so beautiful. Same type of angle, but this is a little bit from the front. No prayer book in the hand, but maybe he's singing a nigun, a melody, talis over his head. He's in the world of davening. He's in the world of prayer. He's in the world of connecting to God. It's not about requesting anything. It's not about standing and sitting. He's about really connecting on the truest way. This is a phenomenal picture of a Chabad shul. Normally in a shul, everyone is on the same page and doing the same thing, standing and sitting at the same time. But you'll notice in this picture that everyone is doing something else. You have one guy who's in the front, facing the crowd. He's davening one way. You have a guy here in the middle. He didn't even put on his talis yet. His hand is in his beard. He's thinking, he's meditating, he's contemplating something deeper. You have another guy sitting there. He's not even facing the front. His talis is over his head. Another guy's facing the wall. Another guy's facing this way. This is how it would look in an authentic Chabad shul. Each person really making an effort to gain the most and maximize to spiritually labor during davening. And here we have another painting, again from Zalman Kleiman, depicting a very similar type of scene. But one of the things you'll notice, you can see the time on the clock here. Look, there's a clock in the top left corner. And it looks to me like the time on the clock is either 1:30 or 2:30. That's what it looks like to me. 1:30 or 2:30 in the afternoon. The shul starts at 10 o'clock. We finish about 12:30. That's very late. Here it's 1:30, and a whole group of people are in the middle of prayers. They're not at the kiddush. They're not having cholent. They're not doing anything. One guy here barely started davening. Why? Because it's not just about jumping into it. Preparation, reflection, meditation. I'm here to work. I'm rolling up my sleeves. I really want to gain something out of the davening. When a person does like that, the davening becomes real in your life. You grow, you develop. Through davening, you change as a person. So prayer, based on everything that we've been saying so far, it's very clear that prayer is literally so foundational to Judaism. From the perspective of the Ramban, prayer is so fundamental to Judaism that it's not even one of the 613 mitzvahs, because it's bigger than one of the 613 mitzvahs. It's greater than one of the 613 mitzvahs. It's a foundation, it's a platform that all of the mitzvahs rest upon. They stand upon it. It's not just one of them. That's how important that it is. The Rebbe compares this to a statement in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says there are 248 limbs in the body, plus and 18 vertebrae in the spine. The question, of course, that's asked is why is the spine not counted as one of the 248? Or maybe we should say there's 249 counting the vertebrae in the spine. If you want to count the spine as one, if you want to count those individually, you should count 18 more. The answer, of course, is why don't we count the spine as one of the limbs of the body? Because it's the spine that holds the entire body together. No spine, you got no body, you're going to fall down to the ground. The spine is not just a limb, it's a part of the body that holds up the same body. So too prayer. Prayer, from the perspective of the Ramban, it's not just one of the 613, it's what holds it all together. Dr. Rebbe writes, the spinal cord that runs through all the vertebrae is not on the list of limbs, and yet it is what sustains and bridges all the limbs from the head all the way to the hips. It is what delivers life-giving energy from the brain to the rest of the body by way of the hips and thighs, all the way to the feet. Heaven protect us from the consequences of the spinal cord being severed. And so it is in the analog with the mitzvahs, which are the 248 limbs of the King God. Our sages declare that all mitzvahs need kavanah, they need intention, and that kavanah is prayer. Prayer is the inner kavanah of every other mitzvah, and it is the mainstay that supports and animates all active mitzvahs. It is precisely like the spinal cord that sustains all other limbs while not being counted as one of the 248 limbs itself. Because, again, prayer is so foundational, it's not just one of the 613, it's the stage that all 613 stand on. When a person prays with all his heart and soul, there's an inner joy that's cultivated, and you live with that joy, and your Judaism literally becomes alive. You have a living, breathing Judaism that's fueled by the emotions invested in prayer. Now, it could be that none of us have 9 hours to pray a day. It's very possible. We may not have that amount of time to invest into our prayer to make it like those prayers. However, certainly a few minutes of the prayers that we do every day can have this quality. We may not be able to meditate on every single paragraph of the prayers, but every week we could certainly focus on 2, 3, 4 lines, or maybe a whole paragraph, and spend an extra 30 seconds thinking about what it means, trying to apply it to your life, reflecting on it, making that paragraph really real and come alive to you. When you do that, you'll see in the course of a whole year, you'll actually be able to get through almost the entirety of davening with real intention and real meaning. And then when you encounter that paragraph the next time, it'll become so much easier to connect with it on a much deeper layer. So you may not have 9 hours, but certainly we can dedicate a few minutes a day to transform our experience of prayer, which will ultimately transform our experience of what it means to be a Jew. Next week on Tuesday, May 9th, is the Lag BaOmer, which celebrates the day that the plague of the students of Rabbi Akiva concluded. His students stopped dying. It's also the anniversary of the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar. It's a great celebration. There's a community barbecue and celebration taking place in the parking lot around the JB. There's all kinds of entertainment, bounce houses, playlands, carnivals, snow coats, candy, s'mores, a barbecue, hot dogs, chicken, all kinds of great stuff, a bike show. You could RSVP and purchase food tickets on this website. You have all these schools that are participating, but also remember Tuesday is opening day for the Shul Black Hats. The barbecue is 4 to 6. We play at 7 o'clock. So the barbecue is mandatory attendance. We don't have that same rules and regulations for the Shul Black Hats, but God willing, we're going to have a phenomenal opening day next week. So I hope everyone will be able to attend. Thank you so much for joining us for 30 minutes of Torah study tonight. God willing, next week we continue, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the Parsha next week. We'll see how it goes.